What's up everyone? Welcome back to the channel. Today I'm gonna share a story that came from a rural patrol officer with 10 years on the job. Someone who spent a decade responding to calls in isolated farm country where properties are separated by miles of dirt roads and neighbors are few and far between. What happened during one call to an abandoned farm was officially logged as a disturbance complaint, routine investigation, nothing unusual. But what this officer found on that property, he saw inside those barns, what he discovered in the hidden basement, that's something that never made it into the official report. Something that changed him permanently, made him leave rural patrol and question everything he thought he knew about human evil. Before we get into it, I want you to think about something. Isolation does things to people, removes the social constraints that keep behavior normal. And when you combine isolation with extreme ideology, with people who've convinced themselves that cruelty serves a higher purpose, you get something truly terrifying. Not supernatural, not demons or devils, just humans doing monstrous things and calling it sacred. If you like this content, hit that like button, subscribe, and comment where you're watching from. Now let's get into the story. Most calls you respond to in rural patrol follow predictable patterns after you've been doing the job long enough. Accidents with farm equipment, disputes over property lines between neighboring ranches, livestock loose on the highway causing traffic hazards, domestic situations at isolated farmhouses where the nearest neighbor is 3 miles away and no one can hear arguments or violence. After 10 years working rural patrol for County Sheriff's Department covering 300 square miles of agricultural land, I thought I'd seen every type of call possible. Thought I understood the rhythm of rural crime, the patterns of isolation, the particular problems that come with policing areas where properties are measured in square miles rather than square feet and response times are measured in tens of minutes rather than seconds. I was wrong. There are some calls that break every pattern, that introduce you to types of human behavior you didn't know existed, that force you to confront the reality that isolation doesn't just breed eccentricity. Sometimes it breeds genuine evil, the kind of calculated systematic cruelty that can only flourish when no one is watching, when no one is asking questions, when distance and darkness provide perfect cover for acts that would be impossible in populated areas. The call to Harrow Farm was one of those, the call that ended my rural patrol career, the call that gave me nightmares for years, the call that made me understand that the worst things humans do to each other don't require supernatural explanations, just belief systems twisted enough to justify cruelty and isolation complete enough to hide it. Before I tell you what I found at that farm, you need to understand something about rural policing, about the vast distances involved, about the way isolation changes everything. My patrol sector covered 300 square miles, most of it farmland, ranchland, forest, with maybe 2,000 residents spread across that entire area. Some properties were 50 acres, some were thousands, some farmhouses were visible from the road, others were at the end of mile-long driveways behind locked gates. Response times to the furthest reaches of my sector could be 30 minutes on a good day, longer if weather was bad or if I was already handling another call on the opposite side of my territory. That isolation, that distance, that's what made the Harrow Farm possible. That's what allowed it to operate for years without anyone knowing, without anyone suspecting, without anyone hearing the screams. The property itself had a reputation, local folklore, the kind of stories every rural area has about abandoned farms and strange history. The original Harrow family had owned the land for 3 generations, farming operation, couple hundred acres of corn and soybeans. Nothing remarkable. Then the patriarch, old Samuel Harrow, died in the late 80s. His daughter Marianne inherited the property, and things got weird. Neighbors reported seeing less and less of her, the farming operation gradually stopped, fields went unplanted, equipment rusted in barns. The house fell into disrepair. By the mid-90s, people assumed Marianne had moved away, left the property abandoned. Occasionally someone would report seeing lights out there, but nothing that warranted serious investigation. Just assumed it was vagrants or teenagers partying in the abandoned buildings. What no one knew, what no one suspected until that November night in 2019, was that Marianne Harrow hadn't abandoned the property, she transformed it, turned it into something else entirely. Gathered people around her who shared her increasingly dark worldview, created a community hidden in plain sight, operating for years while everyone assumed the property was empty. The isolation worked in her favor. The nearest neighbor was 2 miles away. The property itself was set back from the highway behind trees and hills. You couldn't see the main buildings from the road. Couldn't hear anything that happened there. Perfect location for people who wanted absolute privacy, who needed to operate without oversight, who were doing things that couldn't bear witness or scrutiny. I'd driven past the Harrow property hundreds of times during my 10 years on patrol, never given it much thought. Just another abandoned farm slowly being reclaimed by nature. Not uncommon in rural areas where family farms fail and properties sit empty for years, waiting for buyers or inheritors who never come. The driveway entrance was overgrown, gate was chained shut, posted with no trespassing signs. And I'd never received any calls about the property, never had any reason to investigate, never had any indication that anything unusual was happening there. That's what made the call that November night so unexpected, so out of the blue, starting a chain of events that would reveal one of the most disturbing crime scenes in our county's history and end my career in rural patrol because I couldn't handle the isolation anymore. Couldn't drive past empty farmhouses without wondering what might be happening behind locked doors and drawn curtains. The call came in at 11:47 p.m. on a Thursday. I was near the end of my shift. Had been a quiet night, a couple of routine traffic stops, one noise complaint that turned out to be nothing. Looking forward to going home, having a beer, trying to sleep. Dispatch called me. Said they had a civilian reporting suspicious activity at the old Harrow property on Highway 47. Caller was a truck driver passing through, had pulled over to make the call, sounded genuinely disturbed by what he'd seen. What kind of suspicious activity? I asked, already turning my patrol car around, heading toward that sector. Dispatcher relayed what the trucker had said. Lights where there shouldn't be any lights. Lots of them. Arranged in patterns and sounds, screaming or chanting, couldn't tell which. Coming from the property, wanted someone to check it out. Lights and sounds at an abandoned property, probably kids having a party. Maybe using the empty buildings for some teenage gathering, happens occasionally, not a serious concern but worth checking out. Making sure no one's getting hurt, no one's breaking things or starting fires, standard response to this type of call. I told dispatch I'd handle it, estimated 20 minutes to location. Drove through the dark rural roads thinking about how I'd approach it, whether to call for backup, decided I'd assess the situation first, call my partner if it looked like more than I could handle alone. The roads were empty that time of night, no traffic. Just my headlights cutting through darkness, occasional farmhouse showing lights in the distance, otherwise complete rural isolation, the kind of darkness city people never experience. So complete you can't see your hand in front of your face without artificial light. As I got closer to the Harrow property, I started seeing what the trucker had described. Lights visible from the highway, not normal lights, not the steady glow of house lights or security lights, but flickering orange lights, multiple points, arranged in geometric patterns that were visible even from a distance. My gut tightened, instinct telling me this wasn't teenagers partying. This was something else, something organized, something deliberate. I slowed down as I approached the property entrance, saw the gate that should have been chained shut was standing open. Fresh tire tracks in the dirt driveway, clear evidence of recent activity. I radioed dispatch, gave my location, said I was investigating, requested backup as precaution. Was told my partner was 25 minutes out, currently handling a call on the other side of the sector. Did I want to wait for him or proceed? I looked at those lights, at that open gate, at those tire tracks, and something told me I needed to see what was happening. Needed to investigate now before whatever was going on concluded and everyone scattered. I turned into the driveway, headlights off, running only my parking lights, not wanting to announce my arrival too obviously, wanting to see what I was dealing with before anyone knew I was there. The driveway was longer than I remembered, maybe quarter-mile of rutted dirt road winding through overgrown fields and stands of trees. And the further I drove, the stronger the feeling became that I was making a mistake, that I should wait for backup, that I was entering something I didn't understand and wasn't prepared for. The lights became more visible as I got closer, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, small flames, candles probably, arranged in circles and lines and patterns across the open area in front of the main barn. And I could hear something now, rhythmic sound, voices chanting in unison, low and repetitive. Sound that made hair stand up on my neck and arms for reasons I couldn't articulate. I stopped my car about 100 yards from the main cluster of buildings. Didn't want to drive right into whatever was happening. Wanted to approach on foot, assess the situation, figure out what I was dealing with before making contact. I killed the engine, sat in the dark for a moment listening. Could hear the chanting more clearly now, multiple voices. Couldn't make out words, but the rhythm was steady, almost hypnotic, and beneath that was another sound. Harder to identify, scraping or dragging, metal on metal, something being moved. I got out of the car quietly, left the door open so the closing sound wouldn't alert anyone. Checked my flashlight and my weapon, felt my heart rate elevating, adrenaline starting to flow. Body recognizing danger before my conscious mind fully processed what was wrong about this situation. The smell hit me as I walked toward the buildings, acrid and nauseating, combination of burned meat, heavy incense, and something metallic that I recognized from my years of police work as blood. Distinct copper smell that's unmistakable once you've encountered it at enough crime scenes. The smell alone told me this wasn't a harmless gathering, wasn't kids playing with occult symbols for fun. This was something serious, something that involved animal sacrifice at minimum, possibly worse. I approached the perimeter of the candlelit area carefully, staying in shadows, using abandoned farm equipment and overgrown vegetation for cover, trying to see what was happening without being seen, trying to understand the scope of what I was dealing with before revealing my presence. The candles were arranged in concentric circles, maybe 60 feet in diameter, with symbols drawn between the circles in what looked like chalk or paint, symbols I recognized from my basic knowledge of occult imagery, pentagrams, inverted crosses, sigils I didn't recognize but that were clearly meant to represent something. And at the center of all of it was a group of people, maybe 20 or 30, dressed in dark robes, hoods up, faces mostly hidden, standing in formation around what appeared to be an altar, crude structure made from wooden pallets and covered with dark cloth. The chanting was coming from them, all voices synchronized, words in a language I didn't understand, possibly Latin, possibly something else, and they were focused on the altar, on something I couldn't quite see from my position. I moved closer, circling around the perimeter, trying to get a better angle, trying to see what was on the altar, and that's when I saw the blood, dark stains covering the cloth, dripping onto the ground, and shapes that might have been animal carcasses, hard to tell in the flickering candlelight, but definitely organic, definitely dead, definitely the source of that burnt meat smell. My hand moved to my radio, about to call this in, about to request immediate backup and possibly animal control, when the chanting stopped abruptly, all voices cutting off simultaneously, and in the silence that followed, I heard something that made my blood run cold. Human crying, muffled and distant, coming from one of the buildings, someone in distress, someone who needed help. And I realized this wasn't just weird religious ceremony, this was an active crime in progress. The decision crystallized in that moment. I couldn't wait for backup, couldn't stand by while someone was in distress, had to act now, had to intervene, had to stop whatever was happening. I stepped out from cover, turned on my flashlight, illuminated the group by the altar, announced loudly, "Sheriff's Department, everyone stay where you are. I need to see hands. No one move." The reaction was immediate and chaotic, people scattering in all directions. Robes flapping, candles being kicked over, the organized ceremony dissolving into panicked flight, people running toward the buildings, toward vehicles I hadn't seen parked behind the barn, toward the fields and tree lines, everyone trying to escape, no one staying to explain, no one confronting me, just pure flight response. I tried to track individuals, tried to see faces, tried to identify anyone, but the hoods and the darkness and the confusion made it impossible. All I could do was radio dispatch urgently, reported multiple suspects fleeing, requested all available backup, requested air support if available, gave descriptions that were uselessly vague. Dark robes, average height, couldn't see faces, running in all directions. I heard vehicles starting, engines revving. Saw headlights switching on as people drove away fast, didn't try to stop them. Was alone and outnumbered and more concerned about the crying I'd heard, about finding whoever was in distress, about making sure no one was in immediate danger before worrying about apprehending suspects who were already gone. I approached the altar carefully, flashlight beam cutting through smoke from overturned candles, saw what I'd suspected, animal remains, multiple carcasses, goats and chickens and what might have been a dog, all butchered, all arranged around the altar in some kind of ritual display, blood everywhere, symbols painted in blood on the altar cloth, and objects I couldn't immediately identify, bones arranged in patterns, containers of liquid that might have been more blood, photographs, personal items, the accumulated paraphernalia of people who believed they were doing something sacred, something powerful, something that required sacrifice and ceremony and absolute commitment to twisted ideology. But no human remains on the altar, no human sacrifice in progress, just animals. And while that was disturbing and definitely illegal, it wasn't the emergency I'd feared. The crying I'd heard had stopped, maybe frightened by the commotion. Maybe whoever was making that sound had heard police and was too scared to make noise. Or maybe I'd misheard in the confusion. Maybe it had been animal sounds or something else entirely. I stood there trying to decide my next move, waiting for backup, knowing it would be at least 15 more minutes before anyone arrived. And I realized I needed to clear the buildings, needed to make sure no one was injured or held against their will, needed to complete my investigation before everyone scattered completely and evidence disappeared. I approached the main barn with my flashlight and weapon drawn, every instinct screaming that this was wrong, that I should wait for backup, that entering alone was dangerous and against protocol. But that crying sound I'd heard kept echoing in my head, kept driving me forward, kept reminding me that if someone was in distress, waiting could mean the difference between life and death. The barn door was partially open, hanging crooked on rusted hinges, and the smell coming from inside was even worse than outside. Concentrated rot and blood and something chemical that burned my nostrils. I called out again, "Sheriff's Department, if anyone is inside, make yourself known. I'm here to help," but got no response except silence and the sound of my own breathing growing more rapid as adrenaline continued flooding my system. Stepping inside was like entering a different world. The barn interior was transformed from what you'd expect of an abandoned agricultural building into something that looked like a set from a horror movie, except it was real. It was actually there, actually created by actual humans for actual purposes I was only beginning to understand. The walls were covered floor to ceiling with painted symbols, crude but extensive, pentagrams and inverted crosses and elaborate sigils I'd never seen before. Painted in what appeared to be blood mixed with black paint, creating dark rust-colored designs that covered every surface. Phrases in Latin were written in large letters across the walls. Sanguis vitam, ex tenebris lux. Words I didn't understand but that felt threatening, felt like declarations of belief in something dark and violent. The central area of the barn had been converted into a ritual space. The concrete floor painted with a massive pentagram, at least 20 feet across, with circles and symbols within it. And at each point of the star was a station of some kind, tables holding objects. Candles, more animal remains, books and implements I couldn't immediately identify. Chains hung from the ceiling beams, not rusty farm chains but new heavy-duty chains, the kind used to secure things that fight back. And at the end of some chains were restraints, leather cuffs stained dark, clearly used recently, clearly designed to hold people, not animals. My stomach turned, understanding, crystallizing that this wasn't just about animal sacrifice, this was about holding people, restraining them, doing something to them that required they be physically secured. I moved deeper into the barn, documenting everything with my body camera, calling out periodically to see if anyone would respond, checking corners and shadowed areas, finding more disturbing evidence at every turn. There were living spaces set up in the barn, rough cots and sleeping bags arranged along one wall, indicating people had been staying here regularly, not just coming for ceremonies but actually residing in this space. Personal items were scattered around, clothes, toiletries, books about occult practices and satanic philosophy, diaries and notebooks filled with handwriting, and I grabbed one, flipped through it quickly, saw entries describing rituals, describing cleansing through pain, describing sacrifices necessary for awakening. Language that made clear this wasn't role-playing. These people genuinely believed they were doing something spiritually significant. In the corner of the barn, I found something that made me call dispatch immediately with elevated urgency. A makeshift medical station, table covered with supplies, bandages, antiseptics, syringes, medications, and most disturbing, restraints attached to the table legs, clear evidence this was where people were held down for procedures, for things done to them without consent, for medical or pseudo-medical interventions that required force. Blood stained the table, fresh enough to still be slightly tacky, and instruments were scattered around, knives, needles, implements that looked like torture devices more than medical tools. I radioed dispatch, voice tight with controlled panic, told them to expedite backup, told them this was a crime scene involving potential kidnapping and assault, told them to contact detectives and FBI because this was bigger than local jurisdiction could handle. While waiting for backup, I noticed a door I'd missed initially, hidden partially by hanging tarps, door that clearly led somewhere below the barn, wooden steps descending into darkness. The crying I'd heard earlier could have come from down there, could be coming from there right now if whoever was making that sound was too frightened to respond to my calls. Protocol said wait for backup before entering unknown spaces, especially basements or underground areas where ambush was possible, where escape was limited, where danger was highest. But protocol also said respond to persons in distress, render aid, prioritize human life over officer safety in certain circumstances, and I made the decision that this was one of those circumstances, that I needed to know if someone was down there right now needing help right now. I descended the steps carefully, flashlight beam cutting through thick darkness, weapon ready, announcing myself with each step, giving anyone below every opportunity to identify themselves, to call out, to let me know if they were victim or threat. The basement was smaller than the barn above, maybe 20 feet by 30 feet. Concrete walls sweating moisture, dirt floor, and the smell was overpowering, human waste and fear and that same blood smell, concentrated in this enclosed space. My light swept the room, catching details that my brain struggled to process, struggled to accept, struggled to categorize as real things that real humans had created and maintained. There were cages, literal cages made from chain link fencing and 2x4s, 3 of them against the far wall, and in those cages were people, actual living people. And they were looking at me with eyes that held no hope, no relief, just exhausted terror and resignation. I rushed forward, calling into my radio for immediate medical assistance, for ambulances, for anyone who could respond, while approaching the cages, trying to see how many people, what condition, what they needed. 3 people total, 2 women and 1 man, all appearing to be in their 20s or 30s, all severely malnourished, all covered in dirt and what appeared to be paint or chalk creating symbols on their skin, all chained to the walls of their individual cages with enough slack to move a little, but not enough to reach the cage doors. They recoiled as I approached, pressing themselves against the back walls of their enclosures, making small sounds of fear, clearly expecting violence, clearly conditioned to expect only bad things from anyone who came down those stairs. "I'm a police officer. I'm here to help you. I'm going to get you out. You're safe now," I said, trying to make my voice gentle despite the rage and horror I felt, despite wanting to scream at what had been done to these people, at how long they'd been here suffering while I'd driven past this property hundreds of times, never suspecting. I examined the cage doors, saw they were secured with combination locks, not keyed locks I could shoot or pick, and I radioed again, demanded bolt cutters, demanded rescue equipment, demanded that someone get here now to help me free these people. A woman in the nearest cage, probably late 20s, dark hair matted and filthy, finally spoke, voice hoarse and broken. "Are you real? Is this real? They said police couldn't help us. They said police were part of it. They said no one would ever come." The depth of psychological torture implied in that statement, the complete destruction of hope these people had experienced, the systematic breaking of their belief that help existed, that society would protect them, that anyone cared they were suffering, that broke something in me that hasn't repaired. I told them, "Yes, I'm real. This is real. You're being rescued right now. Backup is coming. Medical help is coming. You're going to be okay," knowing even as I said it that okay was a lie, that these people would never be okay, that whatever had been done to them in this basement had caused damage that would last the rest of their lives. I stayed with them, talking to them, trying to offer what comfort I could while waiting for backup, learning their names, learning how long they'd been missing, learning that all 3 had been taken at different times over the past several months, that they had no idea where they were, that they'd been subjected to rituals and ceremonies and abuse they could barely articulate, that they'd been told they were chosen for something sacred, something necessary, something that their suffering would accomplish. Backup arrived 7 minutes later, my partner first, then 2 more units from neighboring sectors. Then within 30 minutes we had a full response, detectives, crime scene techs, paramedics, everyone converging on this property that had been ignored for so long, that had hidden such horrors so effectively. The paramedics took over care of the 3 victims in the basement while we worked to cut through the locks and chains, and once freed, they had to be carried out on stretchers, too weak to walk, too traumatized to function, blinking in the light like people emerging from caves, shielding their eyes from flashlight beams after weeks or months in darkness, watching them being loaded into ambulances, watching them hold the paramedics' hands like lifelines, watching them cry with relief and terror simultaneously. That image is burned into my memory permanently. While the victims were being evacuated, the crime scene team began documenting everything, photographing every symbol, every altar, every piece of evidence, every indication of what had been happening here. The diaries and notebooks I'd seen were collected, bagged as evidence, and one of the detectives started reading through them on scene, his face growing increasingly grim with each page. He called me over, showed me entries that described the group's beliefs, their conviction that they were preparing for some kind of spiritual awakening, that the rituals they performed were necessary, that the suffering they inflicted was sacred, that they were chosen for this work, and that mainstream society simply couldn't understand the importance of what they were doing. The language was disturbing not because it was incoherent or crazy, but because it was articulate, detailed, showing clear thought processes twisted in service of horrific acts. The notebooks included lists, names, and addresses of group members, meeting schedules, ritual calendars, financial records showing how the operation was funded, communications between members discussing recruitment, discussing acquiring supplies, discussing potential new victims they'd identified as targets. This wasn't a disorganized group of mentally ill people acting on impulse. This was a structured organization with hierarchy, with roles, with planning and logistics, with people who had normal lives and normal jobs and came together regularly to participate in systematic abuse they'd convinced themselves was spiritually meaningful. The detective counting names said there were at least 40 people listed as active members. 40 people in our county and neighboring counties who were part of this, who knew what was happening, who participated or supported or covered for the actions of this group. We found more victims, or evidence of more victims, as we searched the property more thoroughly. Behind the barn were shallow graves, 6 of them, marked with crude wooden crosses, and cadaver dogs confirmed human remains in those graves. The diaries mentioned those who completed their journey, those who achieved release, language that suggested these weren't accidental deaths, but people who'd been killed, sacrificed, murdered in service of the group's beliefs. The investigation would take months, would involve exhuming those bodies, identifying them, matching them to missing persons reports, building cases. But standing there in the pre-dawn darkness looking at those graves, I knew we were dealing with multiple murders. Knew that people had died here, had been buried here. While life went on normally all around, while I patrolled past this property thinking it was just another abandoned farm, the barn itself revealed more horrors as daylight approached and we could see more clearly. The chains hanging from the ceiling had been used recently. Forensics found skin cells and blood on the restraints. Found evidence that people had been suspended, had been hung from those chains for extended periods, had struggled against them hard enough to cause injury. The walls beyond the painted symbols showed stains, some old and dark, some more recent, spray patterns suggesting violence, suggesting people had been hurt badly enough to bleed substantially. The ritual space in the center, that massive pentagram, showed wear patterns suggesting it had been used repeatedly, that many ceremonies had taken place there, that this wasn't new activity, but something that had been ongoing for years. In a storage room attached to the barn, we found videos, boxes of tapes and DVDs, digital files on hard drives, evidence that the group had been recording their ceremonies, documenting what they did, creating archives of their activities. The detective who started reviewing those files had to stop after 10 minutes. Looked physically ill, said he couldn't watch anymore without taking a break. Said what was on those recordings was some of the worst content he'd seen in 20 years of law enforcement. They showed the rituals in full detail, showed the victims being brought in, showed what was done to them, showed the group members participating enthusiastically, showed faces clearly enough to identify most participants, providing evidence that would be crucial for prosecution, but that would haunt everyone who had to watch them as part of the investigation. As the sun came up fully, as we could see the entire property in daylight, the scope of what had been happening became even clearer. This wasn't a few disturbed individuals. This was a compound, a facility, an operation that had been running for years with multiple buildings serving different purposes. The main barn for ceremonies, the basement for holding victims, smaller outbuildings for storage and preparation, a farmhouse that appeared to serve as living quarters for some members, workshops where the wooden altars and ritual implements had been constructed, everything organized, everything purposeful, everything designed to facilitate the systematic abuse they were committing. The isolation of the property, the distance from neighbors, the lack of oversight, all of it had enabled this to grow and flourish unchecked. My partner, who'd arrived shortly after me and had been helping secure the scene, pulled me aside at one point, asked if I was okay, said I looked shell-shocked. I told him I was fine, just processing, just trying to understand how this had existed so close, how I'd patrolled this area for years never knowing, never suspecting, never investigating. He nodded, said he understood, said every rural officer wonders about the properties we can't see, the places behind locked gates and long driveways, the spaces where people can do anything without witnesses. "This is every cop's nightmare," he said. "Finding out that evil was happening all along right under our noses, that people were suffering while we drove past." He was right, and that knowledge, that understanding that there might be other places like this that we haven't found yet, that haunts me still. The FBI arrived around 8 a.m., took jurisdiction over the case given the interstate nature of some members and the potential federal charges involved. They brought more resources, more agents, more expertise in cult-related crimes, and they began coordinating what would become a massive investigation involving multiple states. The lead agent, a woman named Morrison who'd worked cult cases before, walked the property with me, asked me to describe what I'd found and in what order, documenting my observations, and when I finished, she said something that stuck with me. People always ask if we take satanic cult stuff seriously, if we believe it's real, and the answer is, we don't care if Satan is real. We care that people who believe in Satan are real and are committing real crimes against real victims. That's what makes this dangerous, not supernatural evil, but human evil justified by supernatural belief. By midday, we had arrested 5 members who hadn't escaped the initial response, had identified another 20 from the documents and videos, had issued warrants, had coordinated with other jurisdictions to apprehend people before they could flee. The arrests would continue for days, but the core group's leadership, including Marianne Harrow, whose property this was and who appeared to be the primary organizer, were still missing, had escaped during that initial chaos when everyone scattered. Morrison said they'd have a much harder time staying hidden with their faces and names public, with resources devoted to finding them, with the full weight of federal investigation pursuing them. She was right. Within 2 weeks, all the primary suspects were in custody. But those 2 weeks felt like an eternity, felt like they were out there planning, recruiting, potentially harming more people before being stopped. The 3 victims we'd rescued from the basement were taken to the county hospital, admitted under false names for their protection, guarded by officers while they received medical care and began the long process of being interviewed by detectives and FBI. I visited them the next day, wanted to check on them, wanted to see if they needed anything, wanted to somehow apologize for not finding them sooner, though logically I knew there was no way I could have known. The woman I'd spoken to first in the basement, whose name was Sarah Mitchell, recognized me, actually smiled weakly when I came into her room, said, "You came back, you're real. I keep thinking I dreamed the rescue." I sat with her for an hour, let her talk if she wanted to, sit in silence when she didn't, just being present, being a human connection to normalcy after months of nightmare. Sarah told me her story, how she'd been abducted from a grocery store parking lot 6 months earlier, drugged, woken up in that basement cage, been told she'd been chosen for something sacred, that she should feel honored to serve the awakening. She'd been kept in darkness except during ceremonies, fed minimally, subjected to what they called purification rituals that involved being restrained, being hurt, being forced to participate in activities she could barely describe. They weren't trying to kill us, she explained. That's what made it worse. They were careful to keep us alive, to keep us functional, because we were needed for the long term for multiple rituals. We were resources, not victims in their minds. We were components of their spiritual work. And they treated us with this weird combination of cruelty and care, hurting us but also making sure we survived to be hurt again. The other 2 victims, Michael Torres and Jennifer Park, had similar stories. Abducted at different times, held for different durations, but subjected to the same systematic abuse, the same psychological conditioning, the same breaking down of hope and identity. Michael had been there for 4 months, Jennifer for 3. All of them had been told that police couldn't help them, that authorities were either complicit or powerless, that no one was looking for them, that they'd been disappeared so completely that no one even knew they were missing. That was part of the torture, Jennifer said, being told that we mattered so little that no one noticed we were gone, that our lives were so empty that weeks could pass without anyone wondering where we were. Whether that was true or not, believing it destroyed something fundamental about self-worth, about mattering, about being connected to the world. The medical examinations revealed extensive abuse. Malnutrition, dehydration, infections, injuries in various stages of healing. Evidence of restraint trauma and psychological damage that would require years of therapy to even begin addressing. The doctors said all 3 victims would have died within another month or 2 if we hadn't found them. Their bodies were shutting down, their systems failing. The combination of poor conditions, inadequate food, and physical trauma was unsustainable. We'd found them just in time. Another week or 2, and this would have been a quadruple homicide. We'd be excavating more graves instead of rescuing living victims. That proximity to tragedy, that narrow margin between life and death, made the rescue feel hollow somehow. Made me focus on how close we'd come to being too late rather than celebrating that we'd gotten there at all. As the victims stabilized medically and began to be able to provide detailed statements, the true horror of what had been done to them emerged. They described ceremonies that involved hours of chanting, of being restrained in the center of the ritual circle, of having symbols painted on their bodies with blood, of being told their suffering was necessary for the group's spiritual ascension, that they were conduits for dark energy, that their pain fed something important. They described the group members as true believers, not sadists enjoying cruelty for its own sake, but people genuinely convinced that what they were doing was sacred work, that the victims should be grateful for their role, that the trauma inflicted was a gift, a pathway to enlightenment through darkness. That genuine belief made it worse somehow, made the perpetrators more frightening because they weren't acting from malice but from conviction. The victims also provided names and descriptions of group members they'd seen, helping us identify people who'd been present at ceremonies, who'd participated actively or who'd stood by watching, who'd held positions of authority or who'd been newer members. This information, combined with the documents and videos we'd seized, allowed the FBI to build a comprehensive picture of the group's structure, its hierarchy, its membership, its activities over time. What emerged was a portrait of an organization that had started small in the early 2000s. Just Marianne Harrow and a few believers, but had grown over nearly 2 decades, recruiting people through online forums, through alternative spirituality meets, through personal connections, gradually building a community of people who shared increasingly extreme beliefs and who reinforced each other's conviction that their actions were justified. The psychological impact on the victims was profound and would be permanent. All 3 developed severe PTSD. All 3 required hospitalization for mental health crises in the months following rescue. All 3 struggled with basic activities of daily living because their sense of safety had been destroyed so completely. Sarah Mitchell developed agoraphobia, couldn't go outside without experiencing panic attacks, couldn't be in crowds, couldn't tolerate darkness, ended up essentially housebound for years. Michael Torres became unable to form relationships, unable to trust anyone, isolated himself completely, refused therapy, refused help, just retreated into himself until he was barely functioning. Jennifer Park seemed to be doing better initially, was cooperative with investigation, attended therapy regularly, tried to resume normal life. Then 2 years after her rescue, she took her own life, left a note saying she couldn't carry the memories anymore, couldn't live with what had been done to her, couldn't see a future that wasn't haunted. Jennifer's suicide devastated everyone involved in the case. Felt like a delayed victory for the cult, like they'd killed her even though she'd been rescued, like the damage they'd done was fatal just on a delayed timeline. Her death made me realize that rescue isn't salvation. That getting people out of physical danger doesn't erase psychological damage. That some victims never really escape because the trauma lives inside them permanently, shapes every moment of every day, makes normal life impossible. I attended Jennifer's funeral, saw her family destroyed by grief and guilt, heard them ask why rescuing her hadn't been enough, why she still died, and I had no answers. Just the terrible knowledge that sometimes evil wins even when we catch the perpetrators, even when we stop the crimes, even when we do everything right. The remaining victims from the graves we'd found were identified slowly over the following months as forensic anthropologists examined remains and dental records were matched. 6 people, 4 women and 2 men, ages ranging from 19 to 44, all reported missing at various times over the previous 7 years, all assumed to be runaways or voluntary disappearances. All actually victims of this cult whose murders were rationalized as spiritual transitions. The families of these victims were notified, went through the horrible process of confirming identities, of learning what had happened to their loved ones, of understanding that while they'd been searching and hoping, their family members had been tortured and killed and buried in unmarked graves on a farm no one knew to investigate. The investigation that followed the initial discovery became one of the largest cult-related prosecutions in the region's history, involving over 70 law enforcement personnel, dozens of agencies, and months of painstaking evidence collection and witness interviews. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit sent specialists who'd worked previous cult cases, people who understood the psychology of group belief, the dynamics of charismatic leadership, the methods by which ordinary people become convinced that extraordinary evil is justified or even sacred. They helped us understand what we were dealing with, helped us see patterns in the documents and videos that revealed the group's evolution from fringe spiritual seekers to organized criminal enterprise willing to kidnap, torture, and murder in service of their beliefs. The member arrests happened in waves. First those we caught at the scene or identified immediately from documents, then those identified from videos as we reviewed hours of recorded ceremonies, then those named by initial arrestees who cooperated in exchange for reduced charges. Each arrest brought more evidence, more testimony, more understanding of how deep this network went and how many people had been involved either directly or peripherally. Some members were true believers, core participants who'd attended ceremonies regularly, who'd helped acquire victims, who'd participated actively in abuse, who showed no remorse when arrested and insisted they'd done nothing wrong. Others were peripheral, people who'd attended a few meetings, who'd been curious about alternative spirituality, who'd gotten uncomfortable and stopped attending before things escalated to criminality, who were horrified to learn what the core group had been doing. The interrogations revealed disturbing details about recruitment and radicalization, how the group had specifically targeted vulnerable people, those going through crises, those seeking meaning, those isolated or lonely or desperate for community and purpose. The recruitment started innocuously. Invitations to discussion groups about alternative spirituality, about questioning mainstream religious values, about exploring darker aspects of human experience, nothing that seemed immediately dangerous. But gradually the messaging became more extreme. The activities became more transgressive. The commitment demanded became more absolute. And by the time new members realized they joined something truly dark, they were already implicated, already compromised, already trapped by their own participation in activities they couldn't admit to without facing serious consequences. Several members described the process by which they'd been normalized to violence, how it started with animal sacrifices presented as ancient rituals, how they'd been taught that physical pain could be spiritually meaningful, how they'd gradually come to accept that human suffering might also serve higher purposes. It didn't happen all at once, one member testified. It was incremental. Each step seemed like just slightly more than the last step. And before you realized it, you'd crossed lines you never thought you'd cross, done things you never thought you'd do, and the group reinforced it, celebrated it, told you that discomfort was ego-resisting truth, that if you felt bad about what you were doing, that meant it was working, that you were breaking through cultural conditioning to access real power. The psychological manipulation was sophisticated, leveraging normal human desires for belonging and meaning to achieve monstrous compliance. The search for Marianne Harrow, the group's founder and primary leader, became a federal manhunt involving multiple states and consuming significant resources. She disappeared completely in those initial moments when everyone scattered, had apparently prepared for this possibility, had resources hidden, identities established, escape plans ready. The FBI tracked her movements through financial records, through family connections, through known associates, gradually building a picture of someone who'd been planning for eventual exposure, who'd understood that eventually someone would discover what was happening at the farm and who'd prepared to vanish when that moment came. She stayed ahead of investigators for 2 weeks, moving between states, using cash to avoid electronic trails, staying with members of the group who hadn't been identified yet, maintaining communication with followers who still believed in her mission. Her capture came from an unexpected source. A member of the group who'd been arrested and who'd initially refused to cooperate, who'd insisted that what they'd been doing was sacred and that persecution would only strengthen their resolve. But after several days in custody, after being shown videos of what had been done to victims, after being forced to confront the reality of their actions without the group's reinforcement and rationalization, this member broke, started talking, provided information about Marianne's escape plans and possible locations. The tip led FBI to a cabin in rural West Virginia where Marianne was staying with 2 other Corps members, still planning next moves, still believing they could regroup and continue their work once attention died down. The arrest went smoothly, no resistance, no violence. Marianne and her companions surrendering when they realized escape was impossible. But Marianne's demeanor during arrest was chilling. Not the fear or resignation you'd expect from someone facing multiple life sentences, but calm certainty, almost satisfaction, as if being caught was part of some larger plan. When the FBI agent read her rights, Marianne smiled, said, "You think you stopped something, but you only delayed it. The work continues whether we're free or imprisoned. The awakening is inevitable. We planted seeds that will grow regardless of what happens to us." That statement, that absolute conviction even in defeat, made clear that this wasn't someone who could be rehabilitated, wasn't someone who would ever admit wrongdoing, wasn't someone who saw herself as criminal, but rather as prophet punished for truth too dark for society to accept. During processing, Marianne requested to speak with me specifically, asked investigators to bring the officer who'd first responded to the farm, said she had something to tell me. Against my better judgment, but with FBI supervision, I agreed to the meeting, curious what she wanted to say, what could possibly justify reaching out to the cop who discovered her operation. She was secured behind glass in an interrogation room wearing orange jumpsuit, looking older than her 53 years, but her eyes were clear, focused, completely sane despite the insanity of her actions. "Thank you for coming," she said politely, as if we were meeting for coffee. "I wanted you to understand something, wanted you to know that what you found wasn't evil, wasn't wrong, was necessary work that the world isn't ready to understand yet." I said nothing, just stared at her, let her talk, let her reveal more of her thinking for the record, for the prosecution, for anyone trying to understand how someone arrives at a place where torture and murder seem justified. "People think Satan worship is about evil," she continued, "but that's misunderstanding the philosophy. It's about embracing aspects of human nature that society denies, about acknowledging that suffering and darkness have roles to play in spiritual evolution, about refusing to pretend that everything is light and love when reality is so much more complex, so much harder." She paused, leaned forward slightly. "Those people in the basement, they weren't victims. They were participants in something profound. They were chosen because they had capacity to transcend normal human limitations. And yes, they suffered, but suffering is how transformation happens, how consciousness expands, how the mundane becomes sacred. The complete disconnect from reality, the ability to reframe obvious cruelty as spiritual service, the genuine belief that she'd been helping people by torturing them, All of it revealed someone whose moral framework had been so completely reconstructed that normal ethical reasoning was impossible. I finally spoke, asked her one question. Did any of them ask to participate? Did any of them consent to what you did to them? She looked confused by the question, like it didn't compute. Consent is a meaningless concept in spiritual work, she said. The ego doesn't consent to transformation. The comfortable self doesn't volunteer for dismantling. If we'd asked permission, we'd never accomplish anything. Real growth requires force, requires breaking down resistance, requires doing for people what they can't or won't do for themselves. Listening to her, understanding that she genuinely believed this, made me realize that some people are so far gone that discussion is pointless, that all you can do is lock them away and hope their influence dies with their freedom. Before leaving, I asked one more question, asked what she'd wanted to accomplish, what the end game was, what awakening she'd been working toward. She smiled, genuine smile like I'd finally asked the right question, and said, "We were preparing vessels, preparing consciousness to receive what's coming. The world is moving toward darkness whether people accept it or not, toward chaos and suffering and transformation. And we were making sure that when the old order collapses, when comfort and safety disappear, there would be people who weren't broken by it, who'd already embraced darkness and could guide others through it. That was our service. That was our sacred work. Preparing the enlightened for the apocalypse everyone knows is coming but pretends isn't." I left that interview understanding that Marianne Harrow was likely diagnosable with several disorders, but that labels didn't capture the danger she represented. The danger of someone intelligent and articulate and completely convinced that atrocity serves higher purpose. The legal proceedings took over a year to fully conclude, with multiple trials for different defendants depending on their level of involvement and cooperation with investigation. The main trial, covering Marianne Harrow and 6 other core members, lasted 3 months and drew national media attention, becoming one of those cases where America confronted uncomfortable questions about religious freedom, about how we identify dangerous groups before they commit atrocities, about whether cult members are perpetrators or victims themselves, brainwashed by charismatic leaders into actions they wouldn't have otherwise taken. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence, videos showing the defendants participating in ceremonies involving clear abuse, documents in their own handwriting describing crimes, testimony from the 3 survivors detailing exactly what had been done to them and who had done it. The defense strategy varied by defendant. Some claimed they'd been manipulated by Marianne, that they were victims of her charismatic control, that they'd been gradually indoctrinated until they couldn't distinguish right from wrong anymore. Others maintained that their actions were protected religious practice, that the government was persecuting them for unpopular beliefs, that consenting adults should be allowed to explore spiritual practices regardless of how transgressive they seemed to mainstream society. A few defendants, including Marianne, showed no remorse whatsoever, used their time on the stand to expound on their philosophy, to explain their worldview, to insist that history would vindicate them, that they were martyrs being punished for truth society wasn't ready to accept. The contrast between defendants who seemed horrified by what they'd done and those who remained proud of it illustrated how the group had contained people at very different levels of commitment and understanding. Victim testimony was devastating. Sarah Mitchell took the stand for 2 days describing in painful detail what had been done to her, describing specific defendants and their roles, describing ceremonies where she'd been restrained and hurt while people chanted and watched, describing the psychological torture of being told repeatedly that she was meaningless, that no one was looking for her, that her suffering was feeding something greater than herself. She broke down multiple times, had to take breaks, but insisted on completing her testimony because she wanted the jury to understand exactly what had happened, wanted them to see beyond legal abstractions to the human reality of torture sustained over months. Michael Torres also testified, his account confirming Sarah's and adding details about male victims, about how gender didn't protect anyone, about how the group's ideology saw all humans as equally useful for their purposes. The videos seized from the property were played in court, edited to remove the most graphic content, but still showing clear evidence of crimes being committed. Watching them in that courtroom, seeing the defendants' faces on screen engaged in acts they couldn't deny, seeing the visible suffering of victims whose identities were protected but whose pain was obvious, created an atmosphere of heavy silence, jurors visibly disturbed, several crying openly. One requesting to be excused after the first day of video evidence, later replaced by an alternate. The judge warned observers that this would be difficult content, that anyone who couldn't maintain composure should leave, but the courtroom remained packed, people needing to bear witness, needing to see for themselves what had happened, needing to understand that this wasn't sensationalized media portrayal, but documented reality. Expert witnesses testified about cult psychology, about how group dynamics can override individual moral judgment, about techniques used to break down resistance and create compliance with group norms, even when those norms violate basic ethics. They explained how isolation, repetition, sleep deprivation, fear, and promise of special knowledge or status can make otherwise reasonable people participate in unreasonable acts. How the combination of wanting to belong and fear of rejection makes leaving difficult, even when you know something's wrong. How gradual escalation normalizes behavior that would have seemed impossible at the outset. These explanations helped jury understand how so many people had been involved but didn't excuse their actions, just contextualized them, showed the mechanisms by which ordinary humans become complicit in extraordinary evil. Forensic evidence tied specific defendants to specific crimes, DNA on restraints matching both victims and perpetrators, fingerprints on ritual implements, financial records showing who'd purchased supplies, who'd rented vehicles used in kidnappings, who'd paid for property maintenance and utilities, creating a web of evidence that was impossible to refute or explain away. The prosecution built methodical case showing organization, planning, sustained criminal enterprise, pattern of behavior that destroyed any defense claims about accidents or misunderstandings or religious practices taken out of context. This was systematic abuse carried out over years by people who knew exactly what they were doing and chose to do it anyway because their belief system told them it was not just acceptable but necessary. During victim impact statements at sentencing, Sarah Mitchell addressed the defendants directly, said, "You took 6 months of my life and turned them into a nightmare I'll never escape. You destroyed my ability to trust anyone, to feel safe anywhere, to imagine a future that isn't dominated by what you did to me. And you did it believing you were helping me, believing my suffering served some greater purpose. That's what I can't forgive, not that you hurt me, but that you thought hurting me was Kenzigism, good, was sacred, was something to be proud of. You broke something in me that can't be fixed, and you think you did me a favor." Her words captured the particular horror of ideologically motivated abuse, cruelty combined with conviction that it's virtuous, making healing even harder because how do you recover from someone who hurt you out of love for higher principles rather than mere sadism? The sentences were severe. Marianne Harrow received 6 consecutive life sentences without possibility of parole, meaning she would die in prison regardless of how long she lived. The other core members received sentences ranging from 40 years to life, some with eventual parole eligibility, some without, depending on their specific actions and level of cooperation. Peripheral members who'd cooperated and shown genuine remorse received lighter sentences, some as low as 10 years, with recommendations for psychological treatment during incarceration. The judge, in delivering sentences, made clear that he viewed this as among the most disturbing cases he'd encountered in 30 years on the bench. Said, "What makes this particularly heinous is not just the cruelty inflicted, but the absolute conviction displayed by defendants that their actions were justified, that combination of intelligence, organization, And complete moral inversion represents a profound danger to society that can only be addressed by removing these individuals from free society permanently. As defendants were led away after sentencing, several looked back at the gallery where I was sitting with other officers who'd worked the case, and their expressions varied. Some showed relief that it was over. Some showed fear about decades in prison ahead. But Marianne's expression was unchanged, calm certainty. She looked directly at me and mouthed words I could read clearly. "This isn't over. The work continues." That moment, that absolute unshakable conviction even after total legal defeat, after being exposed and imprisoned and condemned, that was more frightening than anything I'd seen at the farm, because it meant that true belief doesn't die with imprisonment, doesn't break under consequence, continues burning regardless of external reality. And someone with that level of conviction will influence others, will recruit from within prison, will spread their ideology as long as they have voice and audience. After the main trial concluded and sentences were delivered, the FBI continued investigating the broader network, pursuing leads about other potential victims, other properties that might have been used, other members who hadn't been identified yet. The investigation had momentum and resources and wasn't going to stop until every lead was exhausted. They found 3 more victims, people who'd escaped before rescue, who'd been held temporarily, who'd been too traumatized or afraid to come forward initially, but who finally reported after seeing the trial coverage. After understanding that coming forward was safe now, that the group was broken and couldn't retaliate. These additional victims provided more evidence, more testimony, more names of participants, and the investigation expanded further, ultimately involving over 100 interviews across multiple states, painting picture of a network that had been far more extensive than initial discovery suggested. The Harrow Farm case officially closed 3 years after that initial November night when I'd responded to a suspicious activity call, but it's never really closed for those of us who worked it, for the victims who lived it, for the community that had to reconcile with the fact that this horror had been operating unnoticed for years in their midst. The property itself was eventually sold for a fraction of its value to developers who demolished every structure, bulldozed the barns and the farmhouse and filled in the basement where victims had been held, then subdivided the land into residential lots, building clean suburban homes with no markers indicating what had happened there, no acknowledgement that this ground had hosted suffering and death, just fresh construction and new families who mostly don't know the history. But locals know. Everyone in the county knows. You can't hide something like that in a rural area where everyone knows everyone and stories spread like wildfire. And the property is known as that cult farm, regardless of what's built there now. And some of the lots remain unsold years later because people don't want to live where evil happened. Don't want their children playing on ground that's soaked with victims' blood. Don't want to wake up in the middle of the night thinking about what occurred mere feet from where they're sleeping. The developer tried to erase the past, but you can't really erase something like that. It seeps into the local consciousness, becomes part of the area's identity, a dark landmark that people reference when giving directions or explaining local history. Turn left after the old Harrow place. Never mind that it's not the Harrow place anymore. Never mind that new houses stand there now. I left rural patrol 6 months after the investigation concluded. Couldn't handle the isolation anymore. Couldn't drive past empty farmhouses and long driveways without wondering what might be happening behind closed doors and locked gates. Couldn't respond to routine calls without that voice in my head asking, what if this is another one? What if there are more victims somewhere? What if I'm missing something again? The hypervigilance was exhausting. The constant suspicion was corrosive. The inability to trust that things were what they appeared to be made the job impossible. I transferred to a town station, working in populated areas where houses are close together, where neighbors can see each other, where isolation doesn't provide the same cover for sustained abuse. And even though objectively I know evil happens in cities too, the visibility somehow makes it feel more manageable, more detectable, less likely to hide successfully for years. The nightmares started about 3 months after the rescue and continued for years. Still occur occasionally, though less frequently now, always variations on the same theme. I'm back at that farm. I'm descending those stairs into the basement. I'm finding the cages. But in the dreams there are more cages, dozens of them, hundreds, extending into darkness further than my flashlight can reach. And I know I can't save them all. Know I have to choose who to rescue and who to leave behind, and I wake up with that weight of impossible choice crushing my chest, heart racing, unable to shake the feeling that I'm failing people who need me. My therapist says it's my mind processing the trauma, processing the guilt about not finding them sooner, processing the knowledge that we only found them because of luck, because a truck driver happened to pass at the right moment and happened to look and happened to be bothered enough to call. Without that chance intervention, those people would have died in those cages and we'd never have known. The 3 survivors followed different paths. Sarah Mitchell struggled severely but eventually found stability, years of therapy, medication, support groups, slowly rebuilding some capacity for normal function. She's in her 30s now, works from home doing remote data entry. Lives with her parents who moved across the country with her for fresh start. Has no romantic relationships and limited social contact, but is alive, is surviving, is fighting every day to reclaim pieces of herself that were destroyed. Michael Torres never recovered, remained isolated, unable to work, unable to connect, living on disability benefits in a small apartment. Seeing therapists and psychiatrists but never achieving breakthrough, never finding treatment that could address damage that deep and comprehensive, and he died 3 years ago, overdose, ruled accidental, but everyone who knew him understood it was suicide delayed by years of trying to continue existing when existence itself had become unbearable. Jennifer Park's suicide 2 years after rescue created waves of guilt among everyone involved in the case. Everyone asking what we could have done differently, what signs we missed, what services should have been provided that weren't, whether the criminal justice system that forced her to testify and relive her trauma had contributed to pushing her over the edge. The victim advocate said there was nothing specific anyone did wrong, that sometimes trauma is simply too great. That some people can't heal from certain experiences no matter how much support they receive. That we have to accept that rescuing someone physically doesn't guarantee rescuing them psychologically. That acceptance is hard, feels like admitting defeat, feels like evil winning even when we caught the perpetrators and stopped the crimes. Feels like we saved bodies but lost souls, and doesn't that mean we failed somehow? Marianne Harrow has been in federal prison for 7 years now, housed in a special unit for high-risk inmates, monitored closely because of concerns about her influencing other inmates, recruiting for her beliefs, spreading her ideology within the prison population. Guards report that she receives regular correspondence from people interested in her philosophy, that she's writing a book about her beliefs and experiences, that she holds informal philosophy discussions with other inmates who seek her out, that even in prison her charisma and conviction draw followers. The FBI monitors her communications, tracks anyone who corresponds with her, investigates when concerned that new networks might be forming, but as long as she's not explicitly planning crimes, there's nothing they can do to stop her from talking, from writing, from spreading the ideology that justified such horror. Free speech protections extend even to imprisoned cult leaders, and so her influence continues radiating outward from her cell. Some cult members who received lighter sentences have since been released, re-entering society after serving their time, and I track them compulsively, check on them periodically, make sure they're complying with parole requirements, make sure they're not re-establishing connections, not reforming groups, not finding new victims. Most seem genuinely reformed, attend mandated therapy, work regular jobs, keep low profiles, apparently understand that their involvement was wrong and don't want to return to that life. But a few have slipped back into online occult communities, not the same group but similar ideologies. And I wonder what it means that they serve time and still gravitate toward those beliefs, still find something appealing in darkness and transgression, still identify with philosophies that prioritize ideology over ethics, still carry risk for future involvement in something harmful. The broader community responded to the case with mixture of horror, disbelief, and uncomfortable self-examination about how something so terrible could happen without anyone noticing, without intervention, without community mechanisms catching it earlier. Churches held services addressing evil and how to recognize it. Schools brought in speakers to talk about cult recruitment and coercion. Local government implemented new requirements for inspecting agricultural properties, trying to prevent this from happening again, trying to find balance between respecting privacy on private land and ensuring oversight sufficient to catch abuse. Whether any of these measures would actually prevent another Harrow farm is questionable. Determined people will find ways to hide criminal activity if they want to badly enough. And rural areas by nature provide cover that's hard to eliminate without fundamentally changing the character of rural life. I think about that case every day, not constantly, but it's always there in background, shaping how I see the world, how I understand human nature, how I assess threats and risks and possibilities. Before Harrow Farm, I believed that good people did good things and bad people did bad things. Simple moral framework that made sense and felt comfortable. After Harrow Farm, I understand that good and bad are inadequate categories, that people with genuine beliefs about righteousness can commit atrocities, that conviction and ethics don't correlate reliably, that someone convinced they're serving higher purpose will justify anything, that combination of intelligence, charisma, and ideological certainty creates some of the most dangerous humans possible. More dangerous than simple criminals because they attract followers, build movements, create systems that continue beyond their individual actions. The detail that never made it into the official reports, the thing that haunts me most, isn't any specific image or discovery, isn't the cages or the graves or the videos, isn't even the victims' faces or the perpetrator's lack of remorse. It's the realization that came standing in that barn surrounded by evidence of years of systematic abuse. This happened because people chose belief over compassion, chose ideology over empathy, chose certainty over doubt, and that choice, that prioritization of abstract principles over concrete human suffering, that's something that happens everywhere all the time in less extreme forms. That's the machinery that enables most human evil. That's what I see everywhere now, in politics, in religion, in social movements, in everyday conflicts where people's commitment to being right blinds them to the harm they're causing. And understanding that, seeing that pattern everywhere once you've seen its ultimate expression, that's what I can't escape. That's what changed me permanently. That's what made me realize that the Harrow Farm wasn't an anomaly, but an extreme example of something fundamental, about how humans convince themselves that hurting others is acceptable, necessary, even sacred. And we're all capable of that under the right circumstances, with the right pressures and the right belief systems telling us it's okay.